Hello, everybody. It's July 20th. This is Living Between Worlds. This is, I think, our 19th or 20th conversation over the past 3 years about the mystery of how do we live in these times. Let me throw, we started with two quotes from two very wise people, if I can get my screens to behave themselves here. 120 years ago, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian revolutionary, said, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." And looking into the same space, and perhaps with a bit more of an optimistic spirit, Arundhati Roy wrote, and I know many of you know this quote, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And so here we are. In between that, I'm not going to recount the events of the last weeks and months. You know them all too well. It's a time of great turmoil, not just in the world, but in our hearts and spirits. It's complicated. It's deeply uncertain. How do we live? What do we do? What do we do? How do we speak? Where do we focus our actions? I woke the morning of the Supreme Court EPA decision a few weeks ago, at the end of an incredible week of Supreme Court action, beginning with Roe versus Wade being overturned, then the New York State gun control laws being overturned with exactly the reverse logic that the court used on Roe. Lovely. And some other things, and then the EPA decision, which effectively is attempting to dismantle the ability of the federal government not only to regulate greenhouse gases, but to regulate anything, except, of course, who you choose to love and how you choose to have sex. Those will still be regulated because states' rights or freedom or something like that. So, but I was really struck. I woke up that morning and looked at the news, not with my hair on fire, not running around screaming in rage or in agony, but with a sense of calm and resolution. I thought, isn't this interesting? I give some honor in that to my decades of martial arts training, where I learned not only in my mind, but in my body that fear is not the best response to danger. It's immobilizing. And there are ways to cultivate capacities in our bodies and in our reflexes to respond differently under threat and uncertainty. Saved my life on the highway many times. I'm reminded of Atul Gawande's remarkable book, Checklists. Gawande is a physician and surgeon and writer and sometimes philosopher. Encourage you to read his work. In Checklist, he tells the story of an airliner whose engine started going out at 30,000 feet. Just a short version of it, without going into, there was a lot of forensic behind it, studies of many airline crashes to produce checklists and protocols of what to do when certain things happen, at 600 miles an hour, 5 miles above the earth. And what they did at that point was the pilot turned to the co-pilot and started asking, he was already pulling out the manual. These were days when they had big loose leaf binders in cockpits. And the co-pilot went through the key of engines out, what's the altitude, where are we, turned to page 183 and saw the procedure of what do you do now? The casual observer would think, oh my God, how can you take the time to do that? When we're in an emergency, the plane is going to plummet to earth, 185 people are going to die. How can you take the time to look at protocols? And it turns out that if you look across, dozens and dozens of airline accidents, that's exactly the right thing to do, is to take the time to follow the tested and proven procedures, separate from the terror of the moment, and do what needs to be done. One of the challenges that we have now is that we don't have a manual, and we're facing some crises that are, somewhat familiar in human history and some that are unprecedented. And so there's not a page we can go to that will tell us exactly what to do, but there is something about the process of taking a breath and focusing and being calm, and not surrendering. I hear from some people who say, "Oh, it's all over," whether they're talking about climate or democracy or you name it. It's all over. There's nothing to be done. Nelson Mandela, whose anniversary of his birth was this week, said, "There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lies defeat and death." So I've pinned that. I take some comfort in that. I treasure the reminder of that, from this man who managed to accumulate, whether in his 27 years in prison or before and after, a depth of wisdom that was remarkable and a guidance for us all. So I'd like to do something a little bit different in the call today. I'd like to pose some questions and invite you to, first of all, reflect on them. Let's take some time in silence first to just reflect on these, and then some time to speak to them. And I'd like to ask you, in contrast, in our prior calls, people have raised hands, and I've called them people who are eager to speak. I'd like to invite everybody to speak today, not to put you on the spot. If you don't want to, that's fine. But I want to open the space for that to happen. So I'd like to invite those of us who tend to speak a lot to speak less, to take some time to let the prior speaker's words land in you before you speak. We'll start with volunteers. Raise your hand using the raise hand button under reactions at the bottom, and I'll take people in order more or less. If that quiets down, I may call on you. Please feel free to decline if you'd like to not, but in my experience, sometimes people have things to say and just aren't raising their hands. And I know I treasure all of you and the perspectives that you bring and the experience you bring in the world. So if you'll permit me that indulgence, I will do that. Are you seeing slides at the moment? No. Okay, let's do that. Let's go to a slide. And let's share screen. Sick. There we go. Seeing a slide now. Yay, good. So some questions I invite you to reflect on. Where is your attention? And where's your mood these days? Where's your focus? What are you looking at? Where are you heading? What do you see as the core moves for you to be making? And how have those been changing over the last weeks and months, if they have? For me, they have been. Let's see what they are for you. So reflect on those. And when you're ready to speak, I'd like to ask you to speak to what conversations are you having these days, whether with yourself, because we all do that, or with other people. And let's start that as the point of conversation for all of us together. So let's take a minute or two first. And whenever you're moved to speak, raise your hand. David, I see your hand, but I'm going to hold on you. I want to get some new voices first. Joe Redston, thank you for staying up late. And then Doc Hall, then Deborah Lindsay, and then David will come back to you. Joe, you need to go off mute.
Thanks, Gil.
Welcome.
So I think what's been going through my mind, as in case my accent hasn't given it away, as somebody from the UK who can no longer call himself a European, you know, I'm in a country that recently decided it was better off on its own. I find myself, as I watch what's been happening in the States from afar, and I think we have the same problem, it's the same challenge here as well. So please don't think I'm pointing a finger here and going, what the heck? But I'm wondering whether the declaration of independence is actually the problem. Do we collectively need a declaration of interdependence of some description? And if so, what might that look like? I have no answer to that, but I don't know. That's something that I've been reflecting on, both, you know, over here and, as I say, and watching some of the things over there as well.
Thank you. The great Richard Feynman said that I'd rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. So thank you for that. Doc Hall, then Deborah. Doc.
As you know, I have one discussion group myself, and I participate in several. And so that's one whole arena of conversations. And then I can't get around much anymore. The conversations I have locally are very different. It sort of illustrates a huge split. By the way, I'm in Texas, not very far from Uvalde. And Uvalde could well have happened in the town where I live. But I ran for city council twice, fortunately lost. But did attract a little attention with the theme that the government here needs to spend a lot less time and money trying to develop economic growth and a lot more preparing for everybody to survive in case of disaster. And with the heat this summer, we're having a limited form of that kind of disaster. And true to form, the city is not really prepared for stage 4 or 5 of water restrictions. They should have, but they never did. Anyway, in my other conversations, I think the consensus is building that the system of living that we have in advanced economies today cannot be saved. And more than that, it probably is going to soon crash of its own weight. It can't keep going. Then what? And sorry to say, most of the thinking that's worked with us for some time is that we have to change us. Learn to think as if we were a part of nature, because we are. And we got away from that over the centuries. And so South Africa is called Ubuntu, and it is run so deep that it affects the language. Don't say there are no words for me and you. It's we. I am part of you. You are part of me. Same with a tree. And so that is so deep, I'm not sure we can, at least in this part of Texas, that people can ever make that transition. And I'll shut up.
Doc, thank you. Deborah?
Thank you,
And,
Gail. It's a pleasure
and
to
then
have an
David
opportunity.
next.
So attention, deep self-care. I hope everybody's doing that, because the mood, I think, is just utter frustration, and like on such a deep, incredibly deep level, that trying to find ways to soothe our souls is big in my list right now. My focus is on how do I maximize myself? I'm actually in transition right now. So my next steps are really pivotal. Like I could really do something to make a change, and it's finding those opportunities. And then the conversations that we're having, people aren't talking about it. I mean, my daughters are talking about what Roe v. Wade means to them. There's a lot of conversations happening in the late 20s, early 30s group about themselves and how they're going to protect themselves. But in my peer group, people are not talking. They're like, oh, we're on summer vacation. Isn't it lovely? Yes, it's a bit hot out. It's very frustrating. And so the conversation that I'm having with myself, given that, is very panicky. And I'm really glad to be with people that I can speak with, that, you know, who are really looking at these issues further, because it feels like those around me are not having any conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Glad to have you here. David Schoenbrunn, what conversations are you having, whether with yourself or with others?
I just had a conversation this morning about climate change, in which I was clear that I have no hope for the future, and that preceded the Supreme Court decision. I didn't follow that. Now, interestingly, my mood is rather balanced. It's been dark for quite a while, but recently I feel rather balanced and reasonably good. And so there's a dichotomy between a future that is catastrophic and being okay right now that is a little crazy making, but I'm living that place. And I had an interesting recognition of why I attend this group. And the reason is, as I said, I have completely lost hope in anything that I would consider part of my vision occurring here on Earth. But it keeps me alive to some degree to be around people that still see things in that same light of vision and hope. And I'm not here to splash water on it, but there is, you know, life force in it that I appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Leslie Alden and then Mitch Ratcliffe.
Thanks, Gil. What I'm hearing from everyone is this duality that that David mentioned, you know, the declaration of interdependence and Ubuntu, and balancing the current political global life that we're experiencing and recognizing the continuum. So I've been acknowledging the reality of the now and trying to see it in that continuum, knowing that the world and our species have been through enormous changes over millennia, many millennia, and will in the future too in some way. So I'm not dwelling on the reality of our current politics. very much recognizing it. But in terms of that, I'm pivoting from the work I do on climate to the fall election. I see, you know, grassroots and grass tops and everything in the middle, and the election is extraordinarily important to begin to turn the tide. I don't think it's too late. I don't ever think it's too late, as long as we're doing something. And I think with the idea of taking action and having solutions and being aware of solutions, that does give not only us, but the general public that's aware about climate, very aware at this point, hope. And I think hope is really essential. I think that, Gil, the quote that you gave is, well, all of them, but the most recent one about being able to move forward is really essential. But the conversations I'm having are interesting. I'm someone who volunteers with me and is a good friend, she's a data analyst, you know, the brain, right? She's also a poet and she's an artist. And I didn't realize that she had this interest in art. And it's a background for me as well. And we were talking about both our work that's different and art. And she said she was writing on the ferry and had her sketchbook and was just with a pencil drawing lines on the page. And she said, I start each line with intentionality. And that was just, you know, a light bulb moment, a great reminder of that. Even if it's just a pencil line, there's setting that intention of what you're doing and being very, very focused and very patient about what you're trying to do. So I'm holding on to her experience and trying to absorb that on almost a daily or hourly or momentary basis. Yeah, so it's solutions focus and balancing the conversations about what's happening now and the quotidian, you know, like, what did you have for breakfast kind of quotidian stuff, the stuff as one person said, you know, just sort of the normal conversations of life and trying to balance our life in the now and the greater stuff happening outside of us. So that's where I am right now, trying to hold on to that.
Thank you for that. Two thoughts there. You know, one is I remember a conversation, gosh, a long time ago, 1980s, during the nuclear freeze movement. Someone asked Richard Baker Roshi, who was the abbot of Zen Center in San Francisco, who he thought was the most effective peace activist in the world at that time. And he said with very little hesitation, he said Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk and poet and scholar. Many of you know the work. And Thich Nhat Hanh at that point in his life was spending 6 months out of the year in silent retreat in the south of France. Not busy doing stuff, 6 months sitting. 6 months doing, and was, you know, to this man's assessment, enormously effective. So the quotidian and taking care of ourselves and being able to be whole as we go out into the work seems to me to be deeply important, and it's a place where I'm putting more and more attention. The story about your friend, the artist, is a pebble that is just, you know, dropped into the pond of my mind and is rippling out, because I imagine, and different artists I know do things different ways, but I imagine that she set pencil to page with an intention to start a line, but then what happened is what happened. It's not necessarily what she intended at the start. You know, you start the sketch, and then the sketch emerges. And so maybe that's some of how it is for us, is that we need to start and then see where we go, and then start again, and then start again. Thank you, Leslie. Mitch Radcliffe, Shel Horowitz.
So I actually am feeling hopeful. And the reason is humanity has a tendency to clip the wheels off the plane on the mountaintop before actually landing that plane. And clearly, for a variety of reasons, the collapse of democracy in many nations, the clear and indisputable evidence around us in the weather, here in the Pacific Northwest, the growing season is off by 3 weeks, and I have plants that are simply failing to thrive. These are things that I can talk to people about, and I'm always listening for opportunities to raise the question, well, what do you think about what's going on in Europe right now with that heat dome? We had one last year. Doesn't that seem unusual? And begin to have a conversation about the impact of climate change, and then ask the question, and so what do you think we ought to do about it? And this has helped me have discussions with people who traditionally they're not deniers, but they're not into the idea that we really need to change, and they're starting to acknowledge it. And so encouraging that recognition, and it could even be as simple as, well, you had almond milk on your breakfast. Well, do you understand what's going on with almond trees right now because of the drought in California? They're being plowed down so people can sell the water to cities. Those kinds of things wake people up to the opportunity to make changes. And so that's the way that I've gone about this. And I really am determined to foster that dialogue. So that's the way I have chosen to address what I think is the most dire situation in the last 200 or 300 years. But it's clear to me the time for revolution is nigh, and that revolution will be a bottom-up one rather than a top-down one.
Thank you, Mitch. Shel Horowitz, and then Wendy Brower. I saw you in the chat. I don't see you on screen, but hopefully you're here to go next after Shel.
Okay. So a few things that may not seem to hold together, but actually from the 30,000-foot view, I think they do. One is the importance of celebrating victories. And I will just read one headline I see on the New York Times website. Biden drops plan to name anti-abortion lawyer backed by McConnell as judge. That didn't happen by accident. That had to do with tons of pressure. I must have gotten, 18 different requests to sign petitions on that in a very short time. So we need to elevate and celebrate these victories because people are sinking in despair. There's one newsletter I read, usually comes out 5 times a week, by Robert Hubbell, Hubbell. I'll put the link in the chat when I'm done talking. He is a sort of centrist Biden supporter optimist who's always cheerleading people to go out and see that, yes, you can have an impact. Yes, you can make a difference. And yes, we're making some progress. At the same time, he's totally willing to chastise people like Merrick Garland for inaction. So I just also days ago got back from 11 days in mostly rural Quebec, and they think we're nuts. I had a lot of conversations about what's going on in the US right now. And they are like, what planet are these people on? It was bad enough when Trump got in, but now Trump is out and you're still, as a country, acting so very Trumpian. And the nuances of the makeup of the Supreme Court and other stuff, they don't necessarily follow as closely. But I've also been a real big believer in dialogue and, like Mitch, seizing opportunities when they present themselves to bring the conversation deeper. That's true on my Facebook feed. It's true in my rather limited participation in the local Braver Angels left-right dialogue group. And one thing that I do to keep myself in a positive space is that every day I chronicle the things I'm grateful for and make a public post about it on Facebook. And the day we got back from Canada, actually, the house sitter had left the apartment and the cat in somewhat disarray, and I was upset. And the way I got out of being upset that night was to write my daily gratitude post for all the good things that had happened to me before I got home that day. And it's made me a better person because I now go around all day looking for things to be grateful for and photographing them so I remember what they were when I write it either late in the night or the following morning. So I persist in being hopeful despite a lot of evidence that that's not really accurate, but there's also plenty of evidence that it is. And Gil, you know, as somebody who's worked at the margins of ideas in the green space for decades, you've seen how things that used to be very woo-woo are now pretty mainstream, and how much progress we've made, at least in penetrating consciousness, and how that's starting to meet action. Although I do wonder if Amory Lovins had been as good a marketer as an engineer, would we have back around 1990 started building nothing but net positive or net zero homes as he did in 1984?
Yeah, Shell, thank you. My sense is that Amory's a pretty damn good marketer too. And not that he single-handedly turned the tide, but we're in a very different world than when he published Clean Energy Paths in 1976.
Soft energy paths. Yeah.
Soft Energy Paths. I was on a call earlier this morning with a friend who moved to Houston and is working with the oil and gas industry from a sustainability perspective. I mean, courageous or foolhardy, I don't know what it is. But one of the things that we noted is that everybody in Houston at the heart of the energy industry is talking energy transition.
Mhm.
Now, it may mean different things to them than it means to you, but 10 years ago, everybody was not talking energy transition. And now everybody's talking energy transition. So, there's an example of that. Hope may be hard to come by, but I'm struck by what you're saying, that gratitude is maybe one of the pathways, because it kind of reorients what we pay attention to. I had a singing coach years ago named Sephora Sloan, voice like an angel. And at the end of every practice session, we'd be in a group of 10 or so people. She'd pull out a big glass bowl filled with polished stones, 100 of them, and say, "This is the gratitude bowl." And we're going to go around the circle, and everybody's going to take out a stone and say something that they're grateful for, and then put it in another bowl. And there were 10 of us, and so we each got to be grateful for 10 things. The first one or two were pretty easy to access. The next ones, and the 8th and 9th and 10th, took some real quieting and reflection, and sometimes seeking to find something. But it was a practice. It was not an exercise. It was a practice. It was developing a capacity. Felicia told us after we did it the first time that she does the entire bowl herself every day. 100 things to be grateful for. This is a tradition among some of the traditions of Orthodox Jews, who have a goal to say 100 blessings, 100 gratitudes every day. And it's fascinating to see how it reorients us to how we encounter the world. So thank you for offering.
If I could just very quickly respond, I could have easily gone and done a grumpitude journal every day, and I'm aware.
Yeah, but everybody does those, Shell.
Yeah, well, Andy Rooney actually got paid for it. I'm very glad that I didn't choose that path, because I do think the mindset makes a difference, and that I'm approaching the day looking for things to be grateful for makes me have a better life than if I were looking for things to be annoyed with.
It molds you. Yeah. Thank you. Wendy Brower, and then next Norman Gilroy.
Hi there.
Hey.
I'm at the gym. That's just an example of my energy transition. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No?
Yes.
Oh, you can. Good.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll make it snappy, but back in the fall, I got to go to Scotland for a month around the climate conference. And I have to say, the energy that was there has really kept me going. And so many good things have happened from things that started there. I'm thrilled on the global level. And this is especially with Green Map. And locally, well, among other things, I broke my shoulder back in the fall. I'm bionic now. And I'm in the gym. This is part of the trade-off. I rented a summer house. My partner said, only if we join a gym. So this is my 6th time in a gym in 1,000 years. And it's actually not bad, especially when it's 100 out like it is today. I wish the energy was being used for something, but I will say I was back in the city on Friday, a project called the Dutch Kills Loop. We had a press conference and we had everybody there, borough president, state level, congressional level, city council level. And we're looking at one corner of a fallen in bulkhead. And I can put the article up maybe. But then we had another event the next day. More than about 100 people showed up to clean another corner of it. People are really engaged around regeneration here. And also this Friday.
This is in New York City, folks, that she's talking about.
Yes. Sorry, Long Island City. But in my own neighborhood on the Lower East Side, I've been on a team for a decade trying to get the city to return a rec center to the community. part of the reason I'm involved is because it's high and dry. It's outside the flood zone, whereas the rest of Lower Manhattan isn't. And it's also in the epicenter of lots of problems right now. And just this week, we had a great article in the New York Times, which I think is really going to help turn the tide with the city about what our intentions are and the need. So I'm thrilled about that. And lastly, I don't know if you guys have heard about East River Park, but it's a 60 or so acre park on the Lower East Side that's becoming a bulkhead, a levee. And that included, so far they've cut down 700 mature trees in our community.
Wow.
And rather than only protest, I've also been involved in different ways, including putting out real-time air quality sensors like you guys have out in California. The purple airs have been up for over a year now. And we've also got handheld devices that we loan people or take people on walks so they can see what they're exposed to on a daily basis. So it's very eye-opening right now. And I just want to say that, you know, there was a declaration of interdependency in 1992, and it was by the AIA, International Architects. I begged the IDSA, that was the product designers, to also do one. And they made some very small changes. I sometimes talk to people about that year, 1995 or so. What would have happened if we all turned to climate change instead of the PC? How ubiquitous would our work be now?
Well, what if
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Wendy. Keep pedaling. What if we do that now? There you go.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Norman Gilroy and Trudy. Next. Norman?
Had to take a moment to unmute. Am I?
Of course. We
hearing
hear
you?
you. Yep.
Well, Gil, you and I have known each other for 40 years, I guess, off and on.
Yep.
In California, and come from that beginning point. I've listened into every one of these conversations since they started, and have never spoken. And it's been interesting to me to sort of ask myself why. And a little bit it was at the beginning, they were very intellectual, which I am, but not in quite the same way, and tended to be not in the slot that I was functioning in. So I was learning a lot. So I just shut up and listened and found a great deal to apply. I'm a land use planner and involved in community planning. I've done that internationally for 50 years. And I'm finding that the ideas that are exchanged in groups like this have application in present day circumstances, although a lot of what I'm doing is sort of, I guess you might say, redesigning the Titanic before she hits the iceberg. It's all to do with present day development and how that can be done better. I must say that one of the things that I'm noticing that gives me hope is that the people who are making the decisions are listening to new ideas more than they used to. It's a time, I think, when we've been forced to open our minds in ways that we might not otherwise have done. And we're seeing an opening for new opportunities, some of which are born right here in these meetings, to actually happen, both through legislative action in a couple of cases, even at that level, and certainly at local levels. So from that point of view, I think there's great hope in the present. Now, what we do about the future is a whole other thing. And I appreciated having Joe speak first because he's from the UK, which is where I came from a long time ago before finding Nirvana in California, if you don't mind. And we've done work internationally ever since. And it isn't about California. It isn't even about America. It's really about the whole world people system, ecosystem and people system. My work has all been at the interface between human development and the environment. And we see that now happening on a global scale as it was before, but even more noticeably at a global scale. And
So-
I think getting something to happen at that level is the challenge.
So Norman, let me ask you this. Let me come back to the opening question. What's shifting in the conversations that you're having these days?
Well, what I mentioned was what's shifting is the ability to listen. I think that the ability to listen among the people that I need to talk to and, if you like, convince at various times about improvements in the way we do things, that has changed tremendously in the last 5 years, 3 years particularly, I would say.
Do you have a
With the
hypothesis?
things we could never have done before.
Do you have a hypothesis as to why that's changing?
I think because the entire context in which we live has changed.
Okay. Thank you.
But I know your work and I know what you did in places like Palo Alto and before. And there I saw you as a hero in the sense that you yourself made yourself the change agent. And then you found other change agents within that entity to both train and to encourage to follow the lines that you began.
Yeah,
Now I
sometimes
think that's changed. I think I think those change agents are emerging in a different way.
Yeah, Norman, thank you. I think in the situation like that, sometimes all I did was give people permission.
Exactly.
Just tell them that, like, hey, what you're thinking about, that's a good idea. It makes sense. Keep going.
Yeah.
Sometimes that was the most important thing I would do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Norman. Trudy Hiller and James Boyle are next.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I had one conversation this week that kept me up worrying for a few nights. I live in a very beautiful place in Colorado next to open space. And we were evacuated twice when the wildfires were here around the new year. And my next door neighbor is selling her condominium, and somebody came to look at it. And I was out working in the garden, and the prospective buyer asked me if I had fire insurance, if I was able to get fire insurance. And I am, but of course that may not continue, and kind of gave me a shock.
Yeah.
And I found inspiration at a citizens climate lobby picnic that I went to. And I just, these are people that are dedicated to having bipartisan conversations. They have they're very seasoned. They've been at it for a long time. And they're very calm and well-informed. And I signed up to do what they call tabling, which is you sit at a table at a place, someplace like a farmer's market, and chat with people who come by about the climate situation. So.
And what are you hearing in those conversations with the folks who come by?
Well, I haven't done it yet.
Okay. Let us know next time. Okay.
Yeah, will do.
Okay. Good. Thank you, Trudy. Thanks for doing that. James Boyle and then Alistair next.
Thanks, Gil, and thank you for assembling the group and all the great work you've been doing for 50 years. And thank you to everybody else on this call who spent so much time working for a more just and sustainable world. After the European Union's decision, categorizing natural gas as a sustainable fuel, and then the EPA's reversal of EPA versus Massachusetts, and then then really Manchin's decision to finally kill America's climate strategy. The conversations that we've just been having, has come more into my daily life. So the last week there's been 10 conversations like what we're hearing here. I wonder though about taking whether there's an opportunity to separate feelings, from what we understand to be our character, and to avoid indulging in despair, the feeling of despair, because that's not who we really are or who we really could be, even if the several speakers who have said they see no hope for the global climate system and global civil society. Even if that's true, as human beings, we've been evolved for eons to deal with mortal risk to everyone we know and ourselves, and so we're perfectly prepared to deal with something that I do think is very unlikely to kill us, literally, the people on this phone, on a probabilistic basis over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So it seems to me to really deny our interdependence to each other that Joe spoke about at the offset. If we indulge in our feelings, which are understandable, of despair, instead of recognizing that all good action on climate, even if the entire system doesn't survive, is going to reduce some human suffering. And conversely, all bad action on climate is going to increase human suffering. So those of us who aren't disabled, mentally or physically, it's incumbent upon us to create the lives and the impact that we best can, as best we can, recognizing there's profound tragedy about, as there always has been, and there's a new sort of tragedy about in this entire global system collapse. But we're definitely been evolved for eons to cope with outrageous tragedy, and so if we really have that, it's and I think we might, it's time to get going in an ever more constructive way as best we can until our ability fails.
Yeah. James, thank you. Yeah, we've been on a long journey, and tragedy has been a part of it all the way along. And whether you think of the history of the modern world or of the known human history or the history that David Graeber and David Winslow lay out in The Dawn of Everything, which takes us back 30 to 50,000 years. It's got its ups and downs all the way through, and there've been plenty of opportunities for people to surrender. What came to mind for me as you were talking was the London Blitz in the 1940s, when it would have been entirely sensible to say, we've lost, it's over, let's give in. And people didn't, and they stuck it out. Can I wrestle with you a little bit about despair? I'm going to say there's nothing wrong with feelings of despair. And I'm saying feelings, you distinguished it, you said wallowing in despair. So I feel feelings of despair several times a week at least. But I don't stay
As
there.
do I.
But I don't stay there. And I'd probably be an idiot if I didn't. I'm like, holy shit, there's bad stuff happening here. It's dangerous. It's deeply unpredictable and scary. But I'll distinguish between feelings of despair that are fleeting and a mood of despair that envelops one and that one lives in. Robert Dunham, one of my teachers, says that the mood you inhabit is what's there before your feet hit the ground when you wake up in the morning. Sort of the kind of characteristic emotional complex that you live into. And I may have talked about this before, but my friend and teacher, Fernando Flores, suggests that moods are intertangled with assessments. That if you interrogate a mood, you'll find that there's an assessment that's living within it, an interpretation of what's going on in the world. And then you have an opportunity to interrogate the assessment and say, okay, is this assessment true, accurate, realistic, grounded Is it a habitual assessment that I've always made since I was a kid, or is it based on what I'm seeing now? That opens up some degrees of freedom. If it's real and it's grounded, and I think I think it's relevant, I can then say, well, are there opportunities here? Are there pathways for action? Are there things I could do to shift what's giving rise to the assessment? So I very quickly moved from despair, overwhelm, surrender to engagement with my assessment of a situation in the world that may have some openings in it. And so that's part of the dance that I'm in these days of listening, observing my own mood, of listening for the moods of the people I'm talking with, looking at what are the assessments, or call them interpretations, that are within that, because we all do that. We are interpretation making people. We can't not do that. And one of the openings here we have found is to notice the difference between assertions, statements that this is true, and assessments, this is my interpretation about something that's going on. And knowing the difference between those is enormously powerful, because you can't really debate about interpretations. You can discuss interpretations. You can unravel and go where they take you in a conversation and in a relationship, which is what a lot of you are talking about. I put the word conversation up there, but it's about relationships with other people, right?
And I think there's I think there's another paradox involved. I really like your statement about examine the assessment behind the mood.
Mhm.
And you can examine the assumption behind the assessment.
Yeah.
Okay? So I'm the grandson of uneducated immigrants on both the Italian and Irish side.
Mhm.
And my immigrant families have incredible optimism. And I find that it's paradoxically, it's really grounded in a ripping fatalism. You know what I mean? Like, they expect the world to be horrible. And so the good they can create is magnificent. Meanwhile, I married a wonderful woman who is from a 15th generation family. And they sort of equate, and I'll say this, intelligence with pessimism. You know, like if you're not pessimistic, you're not paying enough attention. And that's because they actually have an expectation of a positive expectation of good outcomes. And then they're disappointed from those. And so it's like, what's your base assumption? And then, when this gets existential for people, it's, are we really entitled to have the majority of people agree with us, or more broadly, are we really entitled to have a thriving world?
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure, but right now it's not thriving, but I don't even know that we're entitled to that. It's right and good, but we may not be entitled to it.
I don't know that we're entitled to anything other than what we make of it.
Exactly.
I mean, the great thing about digging in and looking at my assessments and yours and those the people I'm talking with is that we find that we see the world in different ways. And then I can either say, you bloody fool, or I could say, gosh, that's fascinating. How is it that you came to that assessment? How are you seeing things that gave you that insight? I might actually learn something from somebody who I profoundly disagree with, and vice versa. James, thank you for that. Let's go to, thank you. Take a moment. Let's go to Alistair and then Kimberly up next.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm certainly not doing very much myself. Yeah, my attention is sort of on personal development. My mood, well, I don't really, when I think about the, I don't know, climate change, I don't have much hope. Yeah, my family, I know that's some people that I know don't seem to have any sense of climate emergency. They're still consuming unnecessary gadgets. And yeah, conversations. I was thinking of hosting some conversations with local people. I'm still hesitating on that, but yeah, I think that might be helpful. And
Alistair,
yeah.
tell us where local is for you.
Oh, I'm in Malta, a small
Okay.
island in the Mediterranean. Yeah.
Thank you.
And yeah, talking about not doing much, I also realized I haven't really done anything to help refugees from Ukraine or Yemen or Syria. And I know personally a Catholic priest who's 91 years old and overworked and short on sleep, and he's managed to do something to help at least one or two families from Ukraine. Yeah, and he still runs a center, where he hosts 50 immigrants from African immigrants. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and yeah, this feels a bit awkward, but the Malta is also I guess, one of the only countries in the world where there is no abortion at all, legal abortion. I mean, of course, it happens illegally, but yeah, and I wish I had a strong opinion one way or the other. I don't. There are people who I respect who are pro-choice. People who I respect who are against that. We would say pro-life. Yeah, so that's there. And yeah, one other thing about conversations, not a conversation really, but I've been listening to John Vervaeke talk about the awakening from the meaning crisis. He's got 50 lectures on that, starting from Aristotle and Plato and all that. Yeah, so that's interesting.
Thank you, Alistair. Could you put that name in the chat?
Yes, sure.
People, that would be great.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I can't help but jump in, but whenever I hear people talk about pro-choice and pro-life, it just underscores the importance of framing. Because I'm pro-choice and I'm pro-life. There's a brilliant piece of political work in the United States that captured pro-life as meaning certain things, putting the people who are pro-choice in the position of apparently being anti-life, which is not where we are at all. So without getting into that debate, I just want to underscore the importance of framing and how it sets a context for a discussion, and how it also provides an opening for us to try to unlock framing as a way into a conversation that may feel stuck. So with that.
And just to add something, I remember there was something in the sort of the, from a Catholic point of view, but saying that it's possible to be anti-abortion without being pro-life, if you don't care for women who need help, and so on.
Exactly. That would be a perfect example of that. Thank you. Alistair, thank you. Let me move on. I'll go to Kimberly next. And TR, I don't see your hand up, but you're next on my screen. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to call on you afterwards. And of course, you can always feel free to decline. You're saying no. Okay, well, okay. Kimberly.
Hi, Gil. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here today. Thank you, Gil, for holding this space and supporting us to drop in and feel and connect and be uncomfortable in ways that we maybe otherwise wouldn't in our busyness in life. So I'm appreciating this opportunity. So much is coming up for me. And one thing I'll say from what Alistair just said and how you responded, Gil, about framing, zooming out in a wider context, women have always been for millennia choosing how life moves through our bodies, right? And people with wombs are the gatekeepers of bringing new life into this world. And that's a sacred duty. And there's a lot of complexity, right? Most fertilized eggs do not become viable pregnancies. It's just not how life works, right? And anyway, to just put that wider context of, for thousands of years,
yep,
different ways that women have been choosing and using herbs and supporting each other and understanding our own bodies and the cycle of life that we're part of and that we're serving. And that brings me to the wider point that I was feeling called to name about what supports me in this time of complexity. And all the bad news and all the real pain, and then the projected future pain. One thing that helps and supports and nourishes me is to practice feeling connected to the earth, and whether that's growing my own food, or whether that's just lying down on the earth, or just walking barefoot, or just sitting and sort of noticing a tree, right? Or maybe noticing the same spot, coming back to it day after day, week after week, and forming a relationship with a particular tree, a particular spot, and how it changes over the seasons, what life moves through it, how it grows, and having that almost rewilding myself, right? Humans evolved in relationship with other species, with the earth, with understanding the bird noises, the bird calls, with being able to get meaning from and needing to get meaning from the cycles around us and the life around us, right? And by any little bit that I can reconnect and rewild myself and orient to right relationship with the land that I'm on now, and maybe drawing from ancestral practices, right? And I believe everybody has indigenous land-based practices if you go far back enough, right? Everybody's ancestors are indigenous somewhere. And that way that we can tune in and support that wider knowing, right? And feeling myself as a part of the ecosystem, the organism of the earth, where I'm doing my part.
Yep.
And that helps me to have right sizeness, right perspective, right relationship with life, where I'm here to be of service, I'm here to do my part, and I'm just a small part in this greater whole, and helping me orient to that as I move through the world and do what I can, right? And nourishing myself. Like, we need you for the long haul. We need all of us for the long haul, right? So do what you need to do to replenish and rest and connect, so you can show up for where you're being called and where your gifts can be most needed and useful.
Thank you, Deborah.
So, yeah, holding that.
You. Yeah. You said something that parallels an exploration that I've been on, and in some of the different words you use. You talk about being in relationship with nature and the land and the living world, which is a big step from what passes for modernity to something like that. And I've been sort of venturing, I guess, further than that, and wondering, what would it be like, not if we were in relationship with the living world or treated nature better, but what would it be like if we actually belonged to the living world, which is where you went toward the end there. What if we did business as though we belonged to the living world? What if we lived as if we belonged to each other? And it's a very different, just in asking the question, I feel things shift in me. It's a very different way of living, perhaps different way of doing the things we do in the world. And I suspect that there's treasure there in that question. So thank you for raising that. TR, I see that you've raised your hand after all. Please welcome.
Yes, I did. Thank you, Kimberly, for inspiring me. Belonging. Belonging is the theme right now. It has my attention. It impacts my mood. And I'm at a point where I'm super careful of not getting into conversations trying to get someone who's so far away from me to be in relationship with me. Because I'm healing a certain aspect that was broken. And I'm really curious how many academics actually are really good at what they do because they dissociated so much in their life. And I'm really curious how we help people who don't know they're dissociated become embodied.
How do you do that?
How do I mean that, or how do I do that?
No, how do you do that? Both with yourself and with other people.
Oh, I don't know that I want to do that in public, Gil. I would have a private conversation with you
That's
about
fine.
that because of my complex PTSD, complex PTSD. I don't want to own it as mine, but it is something that I'm healing. But I'm realizing that with the intellectual skills I have and how I functioned before, that there may be a really important gift to give back to the world in helping people realize that what they think is being alive is actually dissociated. So I don't want, at this point, I want to only reach out and do relationships where I feel there's possibility of reciprocity and understanding and belonging for both of us. And if I don't have the skills to be compassionate with that other person, I shouldn't begin that conversation. So that's a real personal commitment at this point. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to expand my skills. The other piece that I'm looking at is from a systems level, how all of us are innocent to the gaslighting we've experienced in our educational process. And I'm really, if anybody else has any sparks flying around this, I want to start a conversation and maybe write about this, because the reason we are where we are is the gaslighting that we used to see in dominance-based relationships is everywhere. And until we claim our innocence, we're going to fight it because we want to prove that we were innocent, and we're fighting it intellectually instead of just embodying our innocence and moving forward from there and treating everyone with dignity. And that sounds maybe too fluffy, but there's a lot of science to that.
Thank you. You know, when I asked you, how do you look at that with, with yourself or with others? I'm reminded of a quote that I just stumbled across again yesterday. Someone asked the great sage Ramana Maharshi, how should we deal with others? And he said, there are no others. Okay, let's go with Kirk and then Ken. Welcome, Kirk.
Thank you. There are no others. And earliest statement about Declaration of Independence and Interdependence, it's all weaving this thing together. I remember Thich Nhat Hanh saying that we suffer from this illusion of separation. And he talked about our interbeing, not being. There's a lot of talk about in be, do, have, being, doing, having. And he's, I think, later in his life moved away from being and focusing on being to interbeing and talking about that. And this illusion that we are separate is simply that, a mirage. And I work on trying to understand that, or I don't know if understands the right word, on living that, seeing that. But yeah, there's a communal way of being that's not in the rugged individualism of many US citizens that I want to get more tightly connected with, because I think this interdependence and interbeing is something I want to experience more. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for that. Thich Nhat Hanh, if you don't know his work, is very radical on this question of interbeing. He's talking not just about mutual relationship and interdependency, but about that we simply don't exist without the rest of the story. Some beautiful videos on YouTube, lots and lots of videos. Look for the one with the match and the flame. To dive into that one further, Ken Homer and then George Mokry. Ken, I was actually just about to call on you and then your hand popped up. What a thing.
Hello, everybody. Gil, something you just said there reminded me, years ago, I read a book called The Gospel According to Jesus by Stephen Mitchell. And Stephen Mitchell is a Jewish man who spent a number of years as a Zen student in the Zen Center in Providence under a very famous Zen master, and he was an author and poet and translator, speaks several languages, reads, writes Aramaic, and he said, I really wanted to know what Jesus said. What can we figure out about what he said? He said, if you go back and look at the Bible, we can be pretty sure that he said two things more than anything else. The first thing he said more than anything else was fear not, do not be afraid, which to me is a, yes, I know. In fact, nothing was written down about Jesus until about 200 years after he died. So that's a whole nother story. But the idea of not being afraid goes back to what you started this conversation with, of being in an airplane about to go down. If you allow fear to get in the way, you're going to go down. So, and the second thing he said more than anything else was love thy neighbor as thyself, which is an astonishing systems thinking, systems theory teaching. Because it says there's no separate existence. What you do to each other, you do to yourselves. And so I found that flashing through my mind as you were talking. And I'm not Christian. I grew up in that tradition. I been there, got the T-shirt, burned it. It doesn't work for me. But I greatly respect. I have a number of people in life who are very devout Christians, and they are fantastically wonderful people. These are not the evangelicals trying to convince other people. These are folks who say, this is teaching that I is core to my being, and I greatly respect that. So I have tremendous respect for the teachings of Jesus, and especially to put them in systems context terms is something I think is really important. On the topic of despair, I know Gene.
Let me just step in for a moment.
Sure.
I just want to say something to that, and I don't want to step on what you're going to say about despair. That thing that Jesus said, which is profound and a deep, deep teaching, is actually the most common phrase in what's known as the Hebrew Bible. It's there 37 times, which gives you a clue that people thought it was really, really important.
Yeah.
So thank you for raising that. Go ahead.
I know Gene Dunaway is on this call. Gene and I met, I think it was 1992 at Deep Ecology Summer School. And Joanna Macy was there. And we did a number of exercises, including something called the Cairn of Mourning, where everyone was invited to go off into nature and find something they felt was threatened, and then to find a stone. We came back and each person would stand up and say, this stone represents dolphins or whales or fungi or whatever it was that they felt was under threat, and say why it was important. We built this thing up, and then there was a process of witnessing people's anger and despair and outrage. And each circle that went in from the outside down to the Tower of Rocks was a layer deeper. So first was a cycle of reporting where you'd say, every 15 minutes a woman is raped by a man in this country, or every 1 minute an area the size of a football field disappears from the Amazon. And people would say, we hear you. So you got acknowledgement for what you were outraged about. And the next circle in was the circle of emoting, which is, I'm so fucking scared, or I'm so fucking angry, or whatever it was. And again, people would say, we hear you. And then the most inner circle was just pure emotion, no verbalized, just people going and crying. And by the end of this event, everybody was on the ground, snot and tears everywhere and sobs. And then it sort of subsided. And there was this long pause. And someone said something, I don't remember what it was, but immediately somebody came back with a rejoinder and the whole crowd burst into laughter. And Joanna said, this happens every single time. If you face your despair collectively, you will come to a place where you can no longer, you've exhausted your emotions, and there's a quietness, there's a void, and then into the void appears humor. And from the humor, people get up and start to go back into the world with a renewed sense of purpose and a cleansing. And I just would love to see this kind of ritual being performed in public everywhere possible, because it's so powerful. And so I hope that those of you who don't know Joanna's work will check out the work that reconnects, because it's really deeply, profoundly moving and so needed right now, because despair is real and people are going to get caught up in it. And those of us who've had the opportunity to work with it and know that on the other side is real power, that's one of the things we're going to need.
Make it so. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
George Mokray.
Yeah, on that point about despair from Ken Homer, I went through climate grief in the mid-90s. And my observation of myself and my further observation of others is that it takes about 6 months. You go through it and then you come out the other side and you say, well, even if everything's gone, I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing because I like doing it. And it's what I've seen others go through, and it never goes away. It comes back. It's recurring, like grief is always recurring. If a loved one dies, you're always going to miss them. And there'll be those moments when they come back to you and you miss them so profoundly as you did at the beginning. But what I wanted to say, I put a lot of stuff in the conversation, but the most important thing was the work of Page and Gillen's, Democracy in America, ? They did a study of policy proposals from 1981 to 2002, over 1,700. And what they discovered was you can have 91 to 100% approval for a policy change, and it passes maybe 60% of the time. 80% to 90%, a little more than 40%. Under that, less than 40%. In my lifetime, since 1973 and the first energy crisis, I've informally followed public opinion on should we fund renewables more than fossil foolishness? And consistently, except for a few years in the second Reagan term, it's been over 70%. My understanding now it's about 72%. Never happened. Still 662 billion per year subsidies for fossil fuels in the United States. And about what, 850 billion in DOE.
George, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm noticing the time, and I want to ask you to come to your point here rather than giving us the data. Okay.
My point is, we all talk about the need to vote, and we need to vote. But this is short-circuiting everything. So how do you get beyond this? We need to do more than vote. But what is it we need to do? And that's the question that I'm wrestling with, and then I present to you.
It's a good question. And I want to ask you again the question. I think there's not going to be time for it now, but the opening question here is, what conversations are you having? you talk, these are conversations you're having with yourself. I know. What conversations are you having with other people is the question I asked at the top, and it's the question I want to leave you all with as we wrap up here. I think the question of democracy is a deeply important one. We're a democratic republic, not a democracy. We're a democratic republic that has been bought and sold, I would say. And that's part of the constraints that we're now operating within. We don't wave a magic wand and have that be different. That's where we are. What do we do? And for me, again, is what are the conversations that we are having and need to have with whom about what that start to open this up. The other democracy book I've been recommending widely, and I want to recommend to all of you, is From Dictatorship to Democracy by Gene Sharp. This has been an international handbook that was behind many of the color revolutions in Europe and the Middle East, and people who facing situations much more dangerous than the ones that we face here. So do have a look at that. And I'm trying to keep up with the chat. It's not very easy to do. I want to thank you for this. Before we close, does anybody else who hasn't spoken have anything they want to contribute to the conversation? Okay, so I just want to say that I really appreciate all of you and your participation in this. And I'm glad that we've gone for a wider conversation today. There's great richness in this room, in this group, and I appreciate what each of you has contributed. I want to remind you that we'll meet again next month. It's always the third Wednesday of every month, so August 24th. Please, if you can, help us enrich this conversation by bringing more diverse voices into it. The way that I think about it is people who aren't like you or me, but who are, and who maybe disagree with you on things, but are open for a respectful and exploratory conversation. We're not here to debate the issues specifically. There's plenty of places to do that, but to have a different kind of conversation. There's a lot in the chat today. If you want to save the chat, use the 3 dots at the lower right of your chat screen to save it for yourself. We don't send out the chat. We will send out the video. Usually takes us a couple of days to get that posted. It'll go up on you'll get a mailing from me, but also there's the YouTube archive, which has got all of these conversations chronicled over the last couple of years. If you're interested in working with me one-on-one, this is a new part of my offering, is working one-on-one. This is called coaching by most people, but working one-on-one with leaders and emerging leaders, which certainly I consider all of you to be, and people that you know, to help be more effective, more powerful, more serene in the times that we're dealing with. And if you want to know more about what I'm up to, that last link there is something I'm experimenting with, as a visual catalog of access to all the games that I've got myself plugged into. So have a look there. We're at the bottom of the hour. Thank you so much for participating, for taking the time out of what I know for all of your very busy lives. I hope you've gotten a little bit of a flavor of each other and what you were each up to, because you're all up to remarkable things. I know some of you have shared your LinkedIn's or emails in the chat. Again, we're not going to send out contact information, so that's the way to be in contact with other people if you care to. And I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you, everybody.